I'm passionate about this part of Australian history. I really want to do it well, and we need to think very carefully before we go too far into a discussion of the Australian Frontier Wars. We need to think very, very carefully about what Australia was like before the contact with Europeans in 1788. Whether we're going to use words like settlement or invasion, dispossession, these kind of words we can argue about later on. That's the area in which politicians sometimes argue and commentators in the media like to argue. But let's get our head around the very basics of what we understand of life before the Europeans' arrival with that first fleet in 1788. This is a map, sometimes referred to as the Tyndale map. This is the map of the territories, the nations of Australia prior to European colonisation. And it's amazing. And I'd urge you to maybe pause for a moment, and I know it's very hard to read on this, but get a sense of what that map looks like. First thing I want you to notice as you look at it is that the entirety of Australia was inhabited. The smaller the coloured areas represent the smaller territories, and often they were densely populated areas. The larger areas show larger territories, and these represent less populated areas. So what we can tell from this map is in North Queensland, in our rainforest and river areas, along the coastline, where resources are plenty, where there are lots and lots of small territories, we have lots and lots of our First Peoples, our First Nations, our Indigenous peoples. So small territories tend to represent plentiful resources, therefore lots of people. Larger areas tend to mean perhaps a more nomadic lifestyle, because there are less resources. Often these are our desert territories, areas where the land itself does not sustain much life. The smaller the areas, the smaller, or I guess the more defined and close-knit those population groups are. So let's get our head around some of those patterns that we should be looking at. First thing I want to point out to you is that the territories are incredibly well known and respected prior to 1788. These were marked territories. They were marked by tradition. There were clans. There were what were called as skins. These different groups had clearly defined national territories, as we would probably try to define it today. Each of the 500 nations thereabouts across Australia had their own traditions, beliefs, languages, social practices, what could be referred to as laws, or the law, L-A-W or L-O-R-E, gets switched around in these communities, okay, in the way we talk about it. But traditions, languages, social practices, cultures varied across all of them. There were some similarities, some huge differences. They are incredibly diverse. The behaviours, the way they lived, the initiation practices, the expectations of different genders, the foods they ate, the areas they frequented, the type of art they did, the type of housing they had, all of these varied from place to place. So we need to be very careful when we generalise. Yes, we can generalise to some extent, but we need to be very conscious that we are generalising and that we are not necessarily doing justice to those groups who don't fit that generalisation. So one of the key issues that is going to be very important in this Frontier Wars unit is to know that the patterns of settlement varied, populations in different areas varied. Broadly speaking, the more we move inland, the population decreases. The more we move along the coastline and north, the population increases. So this will represent to us as violence takes place during what we call the Frontier Wars period of the 1700s, 1800s and early 1900s, as our frontier moves into highly populated areas, but remote areas, the violence increases. So one thing that's really interesting is most First Peoples of Australia lived in the boundaries of what's now called Queensland. So therefore the frontier wars and most of the violence and some of the worst violence happens on our doorstep here in Queensland. Yes, there's other areas that are highly populated in what's now Victoria, around Sydney and in New South Wales and down in Tasmania, West Australia, Northern Territory. But look at the number of nations that called what we would call Queensland now, they called that area of Queensland home. These different patterns of settlements, which did have villages in some areas, did have what are broadly speaking about as campsites, which sound a little bit too temporary for what some of them were, and we can talk about that language later. But the villages, the campsites did exist, but so did agriculture. We have anthropologists and historians and archaeologists identifying the planting of seeds, the gathering of crops later. We have aquaculture, the use of weirs and dams, essentially fish farming. We have engineering in the form of particularly dams and weirs, in the planting of groves, the way rivers and creeks are crossed. We have engineering using the materials of the Australian environment, which in some respects looks quite different to what Europeans were expecting when they came out from Europe. There's trade routes established, what are sometimes referred to as the song lines. There are maps with interweaving lines, dotted lines, crisscrossing the continent. If you like, these lines of trade are like the highways of Australia prior to 1788. I've already started to touch on this. As we talk about settlement and engineering and agriculture and trade, we need to accept that the Australian continent is very different. So there's a very different worldview, a way of seeing life, a different perspective on nature and trade and agriculture and engineering than the European mindset that we're used to. When I say words like engineering now, my European mind immediately thinks of the production of steel and high-tech machinery. I might think of the Industrial Revolution and the building of great steel bridges and so forth. That's a very Eurocentric way of seeing the world that wasn't suited to the Australian environment. The power structures of Europe didn't apply with these nations. Words like nations are European words to describe the gathering of people that matches our modern understanding of nations to some extent. The societies that we can generalize about within these 500 nations tended to be quite egalitarian. They didn't have the hierarchical structures of power that seem to have grown out of our ancient European history of places like Rome, that grew out of our Dark Ages, grew out of our Western European medieval times. Likewise, these indigenous nations don't meet the very medieval hierarchical structures of North Asia or Southern Asia or Southwest Asia, or Southeast Asia rather. These societies were very level in structure. Europeans struggled to find who to negotiate when they came into contact with our first peoples, because there were no concepts of chiefs. There were concepts of elders, but the elders were those who facilitated group decision making. The groups were interdependent but independent. They were connected and interconnected, but at the same time quite separate at times. These boundaries were known. They had alliances and wars amongst themselves. They grouped together for great feasts and corroborees, for great ceremonial times, for marriages, but then separated out. So they were independent but interconnected. Something that will come up at schools a lot is this idea of the spiritual belief of Indigenous peoples, of our First Nations. They were incredibly rich. Something that I've grown to really admire is Indigenous spirituality in Australia. Very, very rich. The beliefs that we have to be very, very careful about, and it's really the place of the elders to teach those beliefs, rather than Westerners such as myself, or perhaps when I was an RE teacher and I was expected to teach these beliefs, I never really dealt with them justly, I don't think. This is the place of the elders to teach. Be very wary when you run across people talking about Indigenous beliefs of simplistic explanations. One last point I'd like to raise with you here is the importance of trying to connect to this pre-contact world through your local environment. The Indigenous world of pre-contact Australia, of our First Peoples and First Nations, is still present. We hear about the Turrbal peoples. We hear about the place names if you holiday at places like Mooloolaba, Maroochydore. When we start looking at, on the Gold Coast, places like Nerang. Australia is full of the place names, and that's part of our story, but find out what the meanings of those names are will help you quite a bit.